And I will also say that this presentation, it builds on a proposal that my colleague Isak Stoddard, who's sat in the front here and speaks perfect Swedish, so if you have any difficult questions, you can aim them at Isak. So it builds on a proposal that we have made to the Climate Parliament about what we think is necessary for the Swedish climate change law to do, some refinements to that law. Is this echoing? Is it okay? It's okay, right, fine. So I've called this presentation From Paris to Sweden, 2 degrees centigrade, integrity, and that's a really important word there, honesty, integrity, and the climate law. And I won't be focusing today so much on the mitigation, on the actual reductions, but I'm trying to focus on what Sweden needs to do in its legislation if it is to deliver on Paris. So what is our mitigation, our carbon reduction commitments in Sweden, and what are they? Well, we have signed in Sweden, indeed all of the EU and almost every country in the world, we have signed up to the Paris Agreement, something hopefully you're all very familiar with. And this has established an unprecedented international agenda, a covenant, an agreement, a commitment, not a target, but a commitment, an obligation, a duty, that has committed us to take action, and that's also important. It's not just to talk about it or to put legislation in place, it is actually to act, to hold the increase in global average temperature below a 2 degrees C rise above pre-industrial levels, and ideally aim for 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it's worth bearing in mind that 2 degrees centigrade, if you live in Sweden or indeed in the UK, doesn't seem too much of a concern, but this is a global average. That's about 5 or 6 degrees difference in the poles. It will have major regional implications around the world. Let's also be clear, at 2 degrees centigrade, many people will die. They'll be poor, there'll be low emitters that take no responsibility for this. They'll live a long way from Sweden or the UK, and they'll typically be non-white. And we have known this for over a quarter of a century. So we have known who we are going to kill. We may not know their names, but we know them. We know their communities. So let's be quite clear. This is an existential problem that we are facing for many people around the world, and that's why those people have asked people like us to aim for 1.5 degrees centigrade, not 2. But also to do this on the basis of the best science that is available, and very importantly, on the basis of equity. And I will come back to that later because this new Swedish climate change law takes virtually no account of equity. In fact, it is highly inequitable. Indeed, the Climate Change Act in the UK from 2008 is similarly inequitable, and I will try to show that later. But I had expected much more of Sweden than I had expected of the UK. So what is our response to this challenge so far? Well, I think it's important to start off with some humility, to be honest about where we are today, rather than to pretend we are doing something. So the first IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, came out in 1990. Now, when I'm talking to students, I always point out that is before their parents had met. Now, that's probably true for some of you here. So for large parts of your lives, if not all of your lives, we have known everything we needed to know about climate change to do something about it. And yet in 2016, the carbon dioxide emissions were 60% higher than in 1990, 60%. And in 2017, they went up by about 1.5%. So despite lots of optimistic rhetoric by people with grey hair, no hair, or dyed hair, people of my generation, we have failed, abject failure of people like me. And I think if you're between the ages of sort of, I don't know, 25 and 5, then you should be really angry at people like me. You'll see them walking around here today, and other people elsewhere as well, your own parents, that we have knowingly chosen to let you down. So let's hear your voices much more loudly than we have done. Why have we failed? We have had a whole litany. This is a Swedish word here, which I think is wonderful. Svindlery. Is that how you pronounce it? Which we use swindling or cons or fraud. This is what my generation has been doing for 25 years. We've had offsetting. paying the poor to diet for us, fly to a conference and plant some trees, or fly to a conference and pay some money for poor people to have solar panels. We had the Clean Development Mechanism, which is state-sanctioned offsetting. We had the emissions trading scheme in Europe. With so many permits, the price of carbon remains almost zero. We've got afforestation people are talking about now. Plant a tree, expand an airport. Just look what Sweden's planning to do. When all of this fails, which it inevitably will do and has done, we are going to rely, and I'll talk about these briefly later, negative emission technologies. These dominate the advice that governments receive from the climate community now. This is technologies that do not exist, that will have to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future. The carbon dioxide we cannot be bothered to stop putting there today. And these will have to be used across the rest of the century. They are really important to, if you're not aware of them, to understand what they are. And when all of that fails, because it will do, we're going to have geoengineering. There are scientists all around the world now planning to fire rockets into space to spread sulfates into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back out into space to cool our planet. What we haven't done in 28 years is try to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. You'd think that would be the first thing you would do. We haven't done it. And I don't just mean other parts of the world, I mean Sweden, the UK, the more progressive countries in terms of climate change. Sweden is a leading nation in the EU on climate change. It has very low carbon electricity. It has an international and I think well-deserved reputation for being a progressive country, particularly if you come from the UK. Sweden is much more progressive than the UK. Yet it remains a high carbon country. Once you do full accounting of Sweden's emissions, you don't just do partial, convenient accounting. Sweden has seen no reduction in its emissions since 1990, nor indeed has Denmark, or the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium. I think Belgium's up 25%. When you take account of aviation, shipping, imports and exports, Sweden has done nothing on climate change so far, and nor have many other countries. So where do we go from here? Once we are honest about where we are and how much my generation has chosen to fail, how then do we turn that round and say, well, let's start to do something? Well, the take-home issues, I think, first is the Paris Agreement is much, much more challenging than most policymakers or scientists are prepared to admit if you put a microphone on them. If you drink a pint of beer with them or half a litre of fizzy, cold Swedish beer, a warm British flat beer is much better. But anyway, if you drink half a litre of beer with a politician or a scientist, they'll tell you how bad it is. But you put a microphone there and I'll tell you some optimistic nonsense about climate change. Long-term targets have no scientific basis. What you do by 2030, by 2045 in isolation is irrelevant. It's just in the future. It means basically doing nothing today. What matters are total carbon emissions. Every time we emit carbon dioxide, most of that will be in the atmosphere, changing the climate for the next 100 to 10,000 years. We are permanently changing the climate by this event here today. By getting here, by having the lights on, by all those other things. We are changing the climate for the next few thousand years. But despite all of this, I think we can just about hold the 2 degrees centigrade of warming, only just. I think if I was asked in 3 years to speak here, I'd probably say it's not possible. I don't think 1.5 degrees centigrade is any longer possible, and I find that quite depressing to have to say that. Well, very depressing. So, what is Sweden's role in delivering Paris? To limit to a warming of 2 degrees centigrade, we have to understand the science and the maths of climate change. So, I could go through all this stuff that I normally do, but I'm not going to, because I've got less time today. So, this is a talk, or this is part of a talk I recently used in Manchester as well with our city council there. So alternatively, it's all about pies or tarts or bula, something like that. To limit to 2 degrees centigrade of warming, we have a set global pie, which is the total amount of carbon that we can emit forever from now. And once we've used up that pie, that's the 2 degrees centigrade pie gone. There's no more pie left. And we have to split that amongst all the countries in the world fairly and take into account of historical responsibility and how wealthy we are on those things. And then we would ask, what is a fair slice of that pie for the EU? And Sweden, of course, is a member of the EU, and the UK is at the moment. I'm hoping to get Swedish residency so I can stay a member. So we then asked the question, of the EU carbon budget, how much is Sweden's? So what's the slice of the carbon budget that belongs to Sweden? And this is work that Isaac, Stoddard, myself, and colleagues at CEMUS in Uppsala have been working on. Provisionally, for those that like numbers, it's somewhere between 300 and 600 million tons of carbon dioxide that Sweden can emit from now out to forever. And that may mean nothing to some of you, but emissions at the moment, if you include aviation and shipping, are about 50 million tons. So a bit of basic maths will tell you that you've got 6 to 12 years of current emissions, and then there'll be nothing left for Sweden. If you take a consumption-based approach, think of your imports and exports, you'd have much less than that time. This budget range includes aviation and includes shipping, both of which are conveniently ignored in the climate change law for Sweden, and indeed most countries of the world usually ignore those, despite the fact they're a large part of emissions. Probably in Sweden, something like 15% or maybe more of all your emissions are aviation and shipping that you think are the responsibility of God or another country. It also excludes imports from other parts of the world, and you can make arguments for or against that. But it's worth bearing in mind it doesn't include those. So the headline message for Sweden, from a mitigation point of view for reducing emissions, is that if we assume firstly that the poorer parts of the world, which are dominated by China, make really rapid changes in their energy systems, much more so than they're normally thought about possible, but I think are just about viable in talking with my Chinese colleagues and people elsewhere. So we're asking a lot of the poorer parts of the world. If Sweden is honest about its commitment to Paris, and the climate change law, I would have to say, is not honest about that commitment, and if its policies are to have a scientific base and are to be based on equity, rather than basing them on astrology and inequity, which I would argue is where we are today, then Sweden needs to reduce its emissions at the absolute minimum 10% starting this year, and the next few years be up to 15% every single year. It would have been much less than that if we'd started in 1990 or 2000 or 2005, but in 2018 we still haven't started. That's at least a 75% reduction in emissions from Sweden by 2025. And a zero carbon energy system in our planes, our ships, our cars, our refrigerators, our industry by about 2035 to 2040. Now, this is very different from what you normally hear. So how does this differ from the climate law? It sounds today like I'm picking on Sweden. Yeah, I'm in Sweden, I do the same thing if I was in Denmark recently or in the UK. I'm not picking on Sweden. Though I do think you have a greater responsibility because you are a more progressive country. People do look to Sweden for leadership. So I think actually, because of your history, you have a greater responsibility. So how different is it? Well, here we have the climate change law. This is Isaac and I doing our best interpretation using the Swedish EPA sort of, reports and so forth, about a 6% per annum reduction. But notice it excludes international aviation and shipping, which the Swedish government are planning to expand, to increase the amount of emissions from those sectors and to lock in a high carbon future. It has no carbon budget framework. In other words, it is not based on science, it's based on astrology. It does include other greenhouse gases. We're assuming here that the reduction for carbon dioxide is the same as the other greenhouse gases. And I won't be talking about those, but the importance of agriculture must not be underestimated. Swedish people need to be eating less meat, drinking less milk. I'm not saying become vegetarian or vegan, but certainly move a long way away from those sorts of high carbon food stuff. If you look at the Johan Rockström recent paper along with his colleagues, their carbon law, as they've called it, a global carbon law, then it's about 7% per annum reduction rates. But I think it is worth bearing in mind that both of these include negative emission technologies. Johan Rockström's paper makes very clear the very large amount of technologies that he is relying on. And remember, he is like me. He's of the generation that's failed. So what we're really saying in papers like that is our generation's failed and the next generation will have to invent these technologies and make them work. Very dangerous, isn't it? Again, we hand the responsibility onto the next generation. They also exclude any concern about equity. They basically say the poor countries will have to do lots more again because we, the rich countries, want a larger part of the cake. That's what we're actually saying when you look at the numbers. If you were serious about 2 degrees centigrade, remember this is 2 degrees, not 1.5, then Sweden would take account of equity and would not rely on negative emission technologies or offsetting or every other form of fraud or swindlery. Then you would need something like the blue line on there at the bottom, the dotted line. Much, much more challenging. Now, I don't want to just pick on Sweden, so let's have a look at the UK, just quickly. You have to say, in terms of the climate law, the Climate Act which we passed in the UK in 2008, is actually a much better document with much more sort of teeth involved in it than the Swedish climate change law is today, 10 years later. And I normally would not say there's good things about the UK compared to Sweden. But this is our trajectory for emissions. Let's take away all the noise off that. That's what our government are planning for, advised by quite a few scientists. And this is the work that I've done with colleagues in Manchester to show what we'd have to do if we were serious about 2 degrees centigrade for the UK. So it is very much like the Swedish position. We are doing something that is nowhere near what's necessary, and Britain, along with Sweden and the rest of the EU, is saying to the poor parts of the world, you cannot have as much carbon as would be reasonable for you to have because we want it for ourselves. We want to expand our airports. We want to fly to Bali. We want to carry on driving large Volvos. So what does all this mean for Sweden's climate law if the law was to be in line with Paris? To meet its commitments, the law must be revised as a matter of absolute urgency. It should be based on explicit global carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, not based on soothsayers, astrologists, or some nonsense from economists. It needs to take account that poorer countries will take longer to make the move to a low-carbon future, and that is embedded in the Paris Agreement that Sweden signed up to. It's embedded in the Camp David Agreement. It's in the Copenhagen Accord. So Sweden repeatedly has signed up to that, and yet it has never taken that seriously, and it hasn't now. It needs to include aviation and shipping. You cannot just exclude difficult sectors just because it's inconvenient, which is what Sweden has done at the moment. It needs to rely on actually reducing our emissions, a radical idea, cutting the emissions, rather than saying we're going to use negative emission technologies, or offsetting, or any other form of scam. And I think it also needs to be, although the main focus needs to be on its territorial emissions, the emissions it has direct responsibility for, I think it also needs to be guided by its consumption-based emissions. In other words, the emissions related to its imports and its exports. So this screen here, the laptop this is working from today, all of these things are made in other parts of the world, and we blame them for the carbon emissions, and then we buy their products, whether it's our clothes, our equipment, and so forth. So we should at least be guided by those emissions. And just to give you an idea, Sweden's emissions with aviation and shipping and just territorial are about 50 million tons. If you include consumption-based emissions, they're about 82 million tons. So it makes a big difference. So Sweden is relying on other parts of the world and then blaming them for their emissions. So to conclude, Sweden's climate law needs a scientific and equity-based foundation. Policymakers need to demonstrate integrity and courage. But there's a really important role for us in this as well. We are absolutely central to this, that we need to support the policymakers when they make difficult decisions. They'll be criticized by the economists. They'll be criticized by certain political parties. Other people will say it's not realistic. We have to be there saying, actually, this is the only way forward. We have to be honest if we are going to resolve climate change. This is an existential threat, and we have to respond to it. I'm going to start to finish off with a quote from Alex Steffen that came out of a Twitter discussion that we had last year. Winning slowly is basically the same thing as losing outright. In the face of both triumphant denialism, which we see in Australia and the US, and a little bit in Sweden, but not so much so, and predatory delay, which we see lots of in Sweden, Norway, the UK, the EU, and most other wealthy parts of the world, where we're deliberately delaying real action. Trying to achieve climate action by doing the same things the same old way means defeat. It guarantees defeat. And that is what we're doing at the moment. We are still sat in the UK with a mindset from the 19th century, in Sweden with a mindset from the 20th century, and we are facing system-level problems of the 21st century. We have to think differently. And at the absolute core of that must be the idea of integrity. So on that note, thank you for listening.